Many homeowners believe their standard insurance policy covers flooding, but it usually doesn't. Timothy Walters explains what flood insurance actually is, who needs it, and why it matters even outside high-risk areas. Welcome back, everyone. Skip Mauney, co-host / producer, back in the studio with Timothy Walters, licensed insurance agent and owner of the Walters Agency. Timothy, how's it going, man?
It's going very well. Got my feet dry.
There you go. That's a good thing. And your socks too, hopefully.
Maybe. We'll see.
Well, Timothy, one thing that is on a lot of people's mind, especially here in East Tennessee, Western North Carolina, flood insurance is a big deal. We just had Hurricane Helene come through last year and wreaked havoc in an area that normally doesn't, people that live here don't even think about flood insurance. And tons of homes were completely destroyed and no flood insurance. So I thought it would be appropriate. What is flood insurance exactly, and why do we need it?
Well, yeah, and Hurricane Helene, yeah, that was god awful. And everybody who lives around here doesn't need to be told about it. Yeah, I think it was hopefully a wake up call for a lot of people. We have this habit, and I talk to people about this all the time. People have this habit in East Tennessee and Western North Carolina, even in Southeast Kentucky, where they get regular flooding because we don't have the TVA control systems up there. But oh yeah, I live, on a hill, or I live, above the floodplain. And I always tell people, say, we all live in a flood zone, all of us. I don't care if you're on the top of Mount Everest, you're in a flood zone. Now, if you're in a high enough flood zone and it floods, we're probably not going to be worried about insurance. But most of us live in places where if there is a flood and it does affect our properties, if we don't have the correct coverage, then it's gonna eat into our pockets, right? We don't have that risk mitigation. So flood insurance, again, to clear up a misconception, a lot of people assume that if there's a flood, which means water rising out of a river, a lake, or perhaps even in a heavy rain pooling up somewhere against the structure of your house, natural water is typically not going to be covered under your regular homeowners insurance. And that's the insurance that's going to be required by your mortgage company. Most mortgage companies that I know of do not require flood insurance unless you are in a high risk zone. Even then,
What?
some don't.
Why is
So
that?
you have to ask a mortgage guy. I'm not sure. I think probably be because probably because floods, although they do cause a lot of damage, especially catastrophic damage, from hurricanes and that kind of thing, I don't think they're considered a common cause of loss across the entire country. You're probably less likely to have catastrophic flood damage in Nebraska, for instance, just to pick a place I think is dry, than say coastal Florida. The lenders down in coastal Florida, they're definitely going to require flood insurance. Maybe not so much Nebraska. And not so much historically here in Tennessee, although I have noticed an uptick in lenders asking for flood insurance in this state. But yeah, it's not typically going to be something that's covered in your regular homeowners insurance policy. It has to be purchased separately. And there's two markets for it. There's private market flood insurance, which we do. There's great companies. It typically provides more robust coverage, and a lot of times it's less expensive than the government FEMA program. But the FEMA program, it doesn't have as many restrictions, and depending on the location, it may be the only flood insurance available. So it's much more common for people in the coastal areas to have FEMA, the government program, than the private flood programs. Most agents who are licensed and are able to quote flood insurance, they'll have access to both the private markets and the FEMA market. Actually, there's private insurance companies that basically write the FEMA policies and manage them. But of course, if they are used, the money comes from the government, the feds, or the taxpayers, as I like to say. So
The taxpayers.
flood insurance is there. It's not because the pipe busted in your house and flooded your basement. That should be covered under your regular homeowners policy. If the river floods over its banks and wipes out the bottom half of your house, then that's covered under your flood insurance. So
So typically, water damage that comes from a river, a lake, dam busting, that kind of thing, or
Yeah.
a hurricane is considered that. But like, that's good to know. If I have a hot water heater that explodes in the basement and floods the basement, that's covered.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's not gonna be covered under a FEMA, flood program. That's gonna, probably be
Well,
covered under your regular homeowners policy. But you want to check your policy first because sometimes there can be some funny exclusions depending on what you're buying. And so it's always a good question to ask
right.
is, what perils are covered in your policy because there's always exclusions, and there's always stipulations. Insurance is a contract. And I don't think most reasonable people try to understand the contracts they sign, but a lot of times we get in a hurry and maybe don't read them as close as we should or don't ask questions when we have the opportunity. So if you have a good insurance agent, you know, ask them. Honestly, speaking for myself and a lot of my people who I know are in this business, we like it when people ask us these questions because we either know the answer and we can educate them, or maybe we're not sure and we got to ask, and that improves our knowledge and make sure that we're taking care of our clients. So never feel you shouldn't be asking these questions. Some people, they ask me questions, they almost apologetic about it. No, please ask me these
Well,
questions.
I got to tell you, as a consumer, I'm embarrassed that I didn't ask more questions. When I moved into this house 5 years ago, I thought homeowners insurance is pretty standard, and this is a good guy that somebody referred and I got him. Not necessarily having to do with flood insurance, but with roof, which, we talked about in a different episode. But it's a good thing I'm with you on this podcast because I'm taking good notes. My next insurance company is going to be, I'm going to pelt them with a lot of questions.
Hey man, we'll have you licensed before you know it.
There we go. There we go. What is flood insurance something that renters should also be considering?
Not really, because flood insurance is really more for the property owners. It's for covering damage to the house or to the owned property of the property owner. So a renter, if you have renter's insurance, you can have a renter's insurance policy, which is going to cover your personal property and your personal liability at the rented location. But it's not going to cover, of course, the landlord's policy. It's not going to cover damage to the structure of the house. So I'm trying to think. I don't think anybody's ever even asked me about flood insurance for renters, tenants. That's something hey, talk about things you're not sure about. I'm going to have to go and ask. I'm going to have to ask some questions. That might be something I can educate myself
There we
about.
go. It's an interesting question too, because if you're a renter, you would assume that your landlord would have some sort of coverage for you. But if you don't have renter's insurance and there's a flood and it destroys your personal property, I don't think your landlord's liable for that, is he?
No, no, landlord. Hey, your stuff is your stuff. Is your landlord has no responsibility for it.
Wow.
The landlord's responsibility is for the property. If the house is damaged, hopefully they're going to have a policy in place that's going to repair or replace the damage to the house. But if their tenant's property is damaged, honestly, unless the landlord deliberately caused the damage, that's none of their business. There's a very clear demarcation, a separation between the renter's stuff and the landlord's stuff.
Gotcha. Well, what about premiums and limits typically structured for flood insurance? How are they structured?
Well, so we're talking about the private flood insurance. I like better because there's no arbitrary cap on the coverage you can have for a house. There is a cap for what the FEMA program will provide for one individual house. Whereas the private flood insurance markets will typically allow you to get coverage up to the full replacement value of the property. So if you have a property the calculated replacement value is $500,000, you're not going to be able to get that covered fully under the FEMA program, but you can probably find a private flood market that will cover that for you of the property owner. So if you have furniture or other possessions in the house, you can actually add on to, it's an endorsement. It's not typically automatically included in a flood policy, but you can actually add on. So if you have, for instance, a house in a flood area that you want to have covered, but you also have a bunch of furniture in there that you want to protect from a flood damage, then you can add that coverage on there. It just costs a little extra or a lot extra, depending on how much coverage you're asking for.
Wow. Well, I'm glad I asked the question. Flood insurance is a very deep subject that we could talk about forever. So maybe we can revisit flood insurance in a future episode.
I like what you did there. It's a deep subject. It can be.
Oh, yeah. Pun intended. Pun intended. Well, anyway, love it, Timothy. Appreciate your expertise. You're helping this guy out, and hopefully a bunch of our listeners as well.
It's like anything else, more informed consumers can only help the markets. And as an insurance guy, as a guy who's been doing this a long time, I want my clients and the broader public to be more educated about what insurance is and what it isn't, because there's a lot of misunderstandings about what it is, and that causes more aggravation for everybody. So we try and do what we can to get that cleared up.
Absolutely. And as a note to our listeners, keep listening to the Walters Agency podcast. You'll learn some very valuable stuff that's going to save you some bucks. Tim, thanks so much. We will see you in the next episode.
See you then.
All right, man.